Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In Australia, at the federal level and at the state level, but excluding here the territories, all parliaments have two houses, except for Queensland. This video is about how Queensland managed to abolish its upper house, the Legislative Council, when other states, such as New South Wales, failed to do so. It involves a bit of skulduggery, a cameo performance from Winston Churchill, and the failure to follow the wishes of the people. Queensland was settled by the British as the Moreton Bay district of New South Wales. It was only separated from New South Wales quite late in the piece in 1859, which was after responsible government had been established in a bicameral parliament in New South Wales. Accordingly, the first Queensland Parliament was also established with two houses, a nominated upper house, the Legislative Council, and an elected lower house, the Legislative Assembly. Members of the Legislative Council were appointed by the Queensland Governor upon the advice of the Premier. There was no maximum number of members, and members could serve for life once appointed. This led premiers to advise the governor from time to time to swamp the upper house with their own party members. But governors in those days had a genuine discretion, and on the whole they resisted advice to swamp the house. The consequence, however, was that the Legislative Council tended to be conservative in nature, and Labor governments found it really hard to get their legislation passed. It was part of the policy of the Labor Party when it came to office in Queensland in 1915 to abolish the Legislative Council. State constitutions, unlike the Commonwealth Constitution, are flexible, not fully entrenched. This means that most of their provisions can be changed by ordinary legislation, and I'll explain about that in a separate video on another occasion. The Queensland Labor government's first bill to abolish the Legislative Council was passed by the Legislative Assembly in 1915, but unsurprisingly blocked by the Legislative Council. A second bill to the same effect was passed by the Legislative Assembly in 1916, but again rejected by the Legislative Council. This provided a trigger for the application of deadlock provisions, which allowed the matter to be decided at a referendum. If the people approved the abolition of the Legislative Council, it would become law even without the agreement of the Legislative Council. Some legislative councillors then challenged the validity of that legislation, which allowed the Legislative Assembly, with the approval of the people in a referendum, to pass a law without the agreement of the Legislative Council. They also argued that any law abolishing the Legislative Council would be invalid. One of the arguments was that the Commonwealth Constitution recognises the existence of both houses in a state parliament. Section 15 of the Commonwealth Constitution says that to fill a casual vacancy, the houses, plural, of the relevant state shall sit and vote together. Members of the Queensland Legislative Council argued, therefore, that the abolition of the Legislative Council would be inconsistent with the Commonwealth Constitution and therefore invalid. The Legislative Councillors lost their case in the High Court. The High Court in Taylor and the Attorney General for Queensland from 1917 held that the Queensland Parliament had full power to enact the law providing for deadlocks to be resolved by way of referendum, and it also had power to use this method to abolish the Legislative Council. The High Court also later clarified, in the case of Clayton and Heffron, which concerned an attempt to abolish the New South Wales Legislative Council, that while Section 15 of the Commonwealth Constitution may have contained a supposition that there would be two houses in each state parliament, this showed no intention of preventing a state from changing its constitutional arrangements to establish a unicameral legislature. The referendum for the abolition of the Legislative Council was held as scheduled on the 5th of May 1917, which was only a day after the the High Court revealed its decision on the case, that the referendum was valid. But it was months before the High Court actually handed down its reasoning. The referendum was defeated, with 179,105 people voting against abolition and 116,196 voting for abolition. The Labor government blamed the loss on a variety of things. They included the controversy surrounding the litigation, the fact that it had only been decided the day before and they didn't have enough time to explain to the people that this referendum was legally valid, and the fact that it was also being held on the same day as a federal election, which of course distracted attention from the referendum. The failure of the referendum meant that the only real way of getting the Legislative Council abolished was to ensure that there were sufficient members in it who would vote for its abolition. This meant swamping the upper house with Labor members. But while in 1918, the Queensland Governor, Sir Hamilton Gould Adams, agreed to make 13 new appointments to the Legislative Council to allow the government a quorum in that house, he refused to make additional appointments that would completely swamp the House, placing it under Labor control. 2 more bills to abolish the Legislative Council were again rejected in the Legislative Council in 1918 and 1919. It seemed the only way of getting around this was to get a new governor who was more amenable to swamping the upper house. Fortunately for Labor, Sir Hamilton was about to retire at the end of 1919. Another plank of Labor's platform was to abolish the office of State Governor. At the very least, they wanted a local appointed as the governor. At that time, governors were all British men who were sent out to govern the colonies. The Queensland government therefore requested that no appointment of a new governor be made until the Premier, who was scheduled to visit the United Kingdom in 1920, could come in person and put his case. In the meantime, however, a Lieutenant Governor would need to administer the state. And for anyone wanting to understand how the chain of command works there, see my previous video on that issue. The previous Lieutenant Governor had recently died. The obvious choice for the replacement of the Chief Justice was the rather oddly named Sir Pope Cooper. But as he was very conservative, the outgoing governor was reluctant to recommend his appointment as it was likely to result in great friction with the government. In October 1919, Sir Hamilton recommended to the Colonial Office, at his government's suggestion, that a Labor Member of Parliament and the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, William Lennon, be made Lieutenant Governor. Initially, the proposal was for Lennon to hold the offices of Speaker and Lieutenant Governor simultaneously. But upon the objection of the Secretary of State in London, it was agreed that Lennon would resign as Speaker and as a member of the Legislative Assembly in order to take up the office of Lieutenant Governor. The opposition in the Queensland Parliament objected to this appointment of Lennon as Lieutenant Governor, complaining that it was extremely partisan appointment and that there was a danger of improper interference in the Queensland Constitution through the abolition of the Legislative Council, contrary to the views of the electors in the recent referendum. Sir Hamilton, however, perhaps naively, said that in recommending Lennon, he believed he would fulfil his duties without partisanship and with a full sense of his responsibility as a representative of the Crown. The Colonial Office felt itself obliged to rely on the recommendation of the Governor and not go behind it, despite their misgivings as to the appointment. The British Secretary of State therefore advised the King to make the appointment. Lennon was to have been sworn in as Lieutenant Governor in January 1920 before the Governor departed back to England. However, the Chief Justice, who was perhaps a bit tetchy about having been denied the office himself, refused to swear Lennon in on the basis of a telegraphed commission, and he insisted upon waiting for the original commission to arrive in the mail. The governor accused the Chief Justice of being partisan and threatened to have his dormant commission as administrator of the state removed. The governor, however, left Queensland on the 27th of January, and the Chief Justice administered the state until the Lieutenant Governor was finally sworn in on the 3rd of February 1920 after his commission arrived in the post. The Premier, Ted Theodore, visited London and argued that the new Lieutenant Governor, William Lennon, should actually be appointed as the state's governor. Viscount Milner, the Secretary of State at the time, refused. He said that a change to a local governor was not yet justified. He announced publicly that the new state governor would be another British man, Sir Matthew Nathan, a former soldier and an experienced colonial administrator who would commence office on the 13th of July. Labor had only a short time to put everything in place to abolish the Legislative Council, as the new governor would also, most likely, be unwilling to swamp the upper house. So Lennon, on the 19th of February 1920, very shortly after he took up his office as Lieutenant Governor, did the deed by swamping the upper house with another 14 Labor appointments to give it control. In the Colonial Office, Lennon's behaviour was criticised upon the ground that he had failed in his duty to advise his ministers to use the existing constitutional deadlock procedure of a referendum before resorting to swamping the House. However, the Colonial Office recognised that if ministers persisted in their advice, a constitutional governor would have no alternative but to accept that advice. Lennon, in defence of his actions, noted that he had been assured by his Premier that his new majority would not be used to abolish the Legislative Council until after the next election. The announcement of the forthcoming arrival of a new governor, however, meant that Lennon would shortly be out of a job. On the 27th of July 1920, the President of the Legislative Council died. This opened up the possibility of the appointment of Lennon as the President of the Legislative Council, for which he was well qualified given his experience as Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. It would also have allowed Lennon to smooth out any procedural hurdles to the abolition of the Legislative Council within the House. However, two difficulties arose. The first was that the Colonial Office clearly did not approve of its vice-regal representatives simultaneously holding a parliamentary office, as had already been shown by the Colonial Office's requirement that Lennon resign as both Speaker and a member of the Legislative Assembly before assuming office as Lieutenant Governor. Secondly, as appointments to the Legislative Council and the office of President were made by the Governor, or whoever was administering the state on the Governor's behalf, Lennon would have had to appoint himself to both positions. The Queensland Chief Justice later wrote to the Secretary of State to recount what then occurred. According to the Chief Justice, Lennon claimed that for health reasons he had to leave the state of Queensland and travel to New South Wales. And that meant that the Chief Justice then had to act as administrator of the state. The Chief Justice was then presented with an Executive Council minute appointing William Lennon, the Lieutenant Governor, to the Legislative Council, and another minute making him President of the Legislative Council. The Chief Justice refused to sign the minutes, observing that the Legislative Council was already overburdened and that the device of sending the Lieutenant Governor across the state border while the appointment was made was farcical. He was appalled. Outraged, Lennon then promptly returned to Queensland, his health apparently having been restored, and then summoned himself, writing a letter to himself, summoning him to the Legislative Council and appointing himself as its president. In an attempt to avoid any potential conflicts of interest or objections from the Colonial Office, it was also announced that Lennon would not take up his seat in the Legislative Council while administering the government of the state. Lenin therefore only assumed his seat in the Legislative Council on the 7th of December 1920 after the arrival of the new governor. By that time, an election had also been held and the Labor government had been returned. A bill to abolish the Legislative Council was reintroduced and passed in October 1921. It was argued that the Legislative Council should be abolished because it was either obstructionist, when the government did not have a majority, and completely useless now that the government did have a majority. The government's, quote, suicide squad, unquote, of members appointed deliberately to abolish the upper house actually acted as commanded and the bill was passed. No referendum was held, so the people had no say in the matter. At that time, the existence of the Legislative Council was not entrenched in the Constitution, so it could be abolished by the enactment of an ordinary law. The only constraint, however, was that the bill had to be reserved for the King's assent. Petitions were then sent to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill, and the King, asking that assent to the bill be withheld until the people had approved its abolition by way of a referendum, or the legality of its abolition was first tested in the Privy Council. Churchill, however, responded, quote, "After careful consideration of all the circumstances, I cannot but regard the matter with which the bill deals as essentially one for local determination," unquote. Royal assent was given and the Act was proclaimed to come into force on the 23rd of March 1922. Lenin, of course, consequently lost his job, but he was rewarded by the government by being paid a salary of £1,000 per year to continue as Lieutenant Governor even when he was not administering the state. An Australian was not appointed as Governor of Queensland until 1946. In 1934, under a Labor government, the Queensland Parliament amended the state constitution so that the Legislative Council cannot be restored in Queensland without the approval of the people in a referendum, which is rather ironic given that its abolition occurred without the approval of the people in a referendum. Now, this, of course, is the reverse of the position in New South Wales, where the Legislative Council cannot be abolished without a referendum. In New South Wales, the suicide squad method was copied from Queensland, but it failed when some of the newly appointed Labor members decided they quite liked the comfortable red benches of the Legislative Council and refused to vote for their own abolition. A subsequent referendum to abolish the Legislative Council in New South Wales also failed. That's why New South Wales has a Legislative Council and Queensland does not. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you found this little vignette of constitutional history quite interesting. And as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.